Well, thank you, Jim. Is this good? Is the audio good? Yeah. Yeah, this is my first trip down under, and I'm having a wonderful time. It's been quite a remarkable week. All kinds of incredible events going on, and it's been great fun for me. I'm a wildlife. You can't hear? Is that better? Okay. I'm a wildlife photographer, and I've been having a great time going out in the bush, getting all kinds of pictures of animals I'd only seen in zoos before, and some I hadn't seen in zoos. So it's been great fun. Like I said, I'm going to give you a little bit of the big picture here, of what's been going on this week, which you might not be aware of. So, last year, the Obama administration decided one of the ways they were going to try to silence skeptics was by suing them and going after skeptical organizations, harassing them to get all of their emails. And they organized this through as much of state attorney generals in the United States. And the group that the group they went after first was the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., which is an organization which Dr. Ball's been associated with for a long time. And I've been going to their meetings pretty regularly for the last few years. So I was at CEI when all this stuff was going on last year. And they fought back pretty vigorously. They have very good lawyers, and they basically turned it around on the attorney generals and put them in a very defensive position. But Obama made a huge mistake in doing this because they made a very strong enemy. And just today, it was announced that officially that Myron Ebell, the head of the Competitive Enterprise Institute, is going to be Trump's interim head of the EPA. so he made Myron mad, and I don't think Obama's going to like Myron when he's mad. in the words of the Hulk. So Trump has promised on day one to undo all of Obama's illegal climate deals. So that would include the Paris Treaty, and it would include all of the illegal regulations, EPA regulations that have been put on. And he's got just the right guy to do it. I can't imagine anyone better than Myron Ebell to take care of it. If I was going to pick anyone in the world, that would be the guy. And it shows me that Trump has very good judgment. But this story goes further than this. So I spoke with Myron this afternoon. The presentation I'm going to show you tonight, I presented it to Myron and CEI last week before I came down here as a practice run. So Myron knew I was here doing this. So I spoke with Myron today. Myron has invited your Senator Malcolm Roberts up to their next meeting to introduce himself. And Myron told me that he's also going to introduce Malcolm to all the right people. So I don't know if that includes the next president of the United States or not. But One Nation has got a huge in to the U.S. government now, and particularly in light of some of the bad behavior of some of the people in the other parties today. So this is a huge coup for One Nation. Which ties into the Trump victory. So, and I was in Pauline's office yesterday and Malcolm's office yesterday, and everyone was so excited about this. It was like Trump was one of them. It was great. And you may have seen us. There was a video on the news of Pauline and Malcolm and myself toasting Trump's win. so it was, so it was quite fun. But anyway, so we'll get into the presentation now. The title of my presentation is The Emperor's New Climate. And the Emperor's New Clothes was a story of people blindly trusting authority. There were three experts in the kingdom who said that the emperor was wearing fine new clothing. Nobody else could see it. The king couldn't see it. But the king didn't feel like he was qualified to question the experts. So he went along with their scam. And certainly the king's advisors didn't feel qualified to contest the king or his experts, so they went along with it. And the king's subjects didn't want to get their heads cut off, so they went along with it. So everyone went along with it, and the emperor's paraded around butt naked in front of his kingdom. And finally, a small child steps up and says, "The king's not wearing any clothes." So this leads into my favorite Galileo quote: "In questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual." And in the case of the emperor's new clothes, that would have been the child. He had all these adults telling him the king's wearing clothes, and the child stated the obvious, that he wasn't. So this is one of my favorite articles from the Brisbane Courier from 145 years ago, titled "Imaginary Changes of Climate." And it's basically an article poking fun at people in the press and all climate alarmists from 1871 who are sure that the climate was changing catastrophically. And every season is sure to be extraordinary. Almost every month, one of the driest or wettest, windiest, hottest ever known. Much observation, which ought to correct a tendency to exaggerate, seems in some minds to have rather a tendency to increase it. So this climate alarmism thing's been going on forever. It's nothing new. The press always wants to have a big story, so it's this is the hottest year ever, the driest year ever, whatever. It's been going on for as long as humans have been communicating, and I'm sure it'll continue forever too. But a lot of the problem is just that climate is cyclical. It's changing. We go through several year cycles. And after a few years of drought, people think, oh, it's always going to be dry. After years of wet, it's always going to be wet. This is an article from the Empire in Sydney from 46. I don't have my glasses on. But it just goes back to 1780. Sorry. Bigger? I don't think I can. Sorry. But it just... Drought in 1789, drought. This is by years. Then floods, then slight drought, flood, severe drought, flood. It just shows how the early records from Southeast Australia showed that it was a constant series. They were either in drought all the time or they're in flood all the time, and it was cyclical. The same thing that people see now. The same thing that BOM gets hysterical about every time it goes one way or the other. Okay, so one of the things that Malcolm was making a big deal about, that Jim was just talking about earlier, was this no empirical evidence thing. This was the 1990 IPCC report before Michael Mann came in and corrupted it in 2001. I think Steve McIntyre thought that this graph was based strictly on Central England temperatures, but I don't think that's correct, because James Hansen wrote a paper in 1982 that was very similar. It was based on several sites around the world, including Central England, I think Greenland, and California, which was almost identical. But basically what it shows, those pink lines, the top graph is, I know it's probably hard to see in the back, the top graph is the last 10,000 years, and the pink line shows the recent warming over the last 140 years or so. And it shows that it's completely within the noise of natural variability and essentially nothing. So how could you possibly call that empirical evidence? It's just noise. And then the bottom graph was the last 1,000 years, showing that once again the warming, the pink bar shows the warming over the last 140 years or so. And once again, it's completely in the range of natural variability. And the medieval warm period was much warmer, and the Little Ice Age was much colder. So there's no evidence, there's no scientific evidence whatsoever that humans have impacted the climate, other than until 2001 when Michael Mann impacted the climate by creating fake data, fake climate data. I guess I should be careful saying that, right, Tim? So, and furthermore, in the place of any actual empirical evidence, they go to their climate models. I'm a computer guy. I used to do help NCAR. One time I was helping NCAR speed up their computers. And so with faster and faster computers, they can crank out garbage climate forecasts much faster than they used to be able to. It's very exciting. Okay, so this is an interesting story about NCAR. So I live in Boulder, Colorado, which I proudly call the epicenter of climate fraud. We have NCAR, the National Snow and Ice Data Center, NOAA, the CU sea level people, all a bunch of crooks on the government dole. But the yellow bar on top. This is a graph from Carl Mears at RSS. There's two satellite groups. One is UAH, which is John Christie and Roy Spencer. And the other group is RSS, which is Carl Mears. And Carl Mears is generally likes to pretend that he's an alarmist. So I find this graph, it's harder for people to argue against it because Carl Mears is one of them. But the yellow shows the model predictions and the blue shows the actual satellite measured troposphere temperatures. And it shows that the models are pretty much useless, or perhaps worse than useless. And so in light of any actual empirical evidence, they use models as empirical evidence, but even that doesn't work because the models don't work. I think Einstein made a joke once, if the data doesn't match your theory, change the data. But he was joking, and unfortunately climate scientists took him seriously. So this is my favorite guy, Professor Brian Cox. He has a lot more hair than I do. BBC presenter, and Brian, he was on this Q&A show with Malcolm a couple months ago, and he held up. He says, "I've got the graph, the official graph, anointed with holy water by NASA." It implied that anybody who didn't think that graph meant we were all going to just be destroyed by global warming probably also meant that probably means you also didn't believe we went to the moon, which I found to be pretty entertaining because I actually happen to know something about the people who went to the moon who have a very different opinion. Okay, so my senator in New Mexico when I lived in New Mexico was Harrison Schmitt. He was the only scientist to have ever set foot on the moon. He's Harvard PhD in geology, very well-known climate skeptic, great guy, very intelligent guy. And so we have 100% of scientists who walked on the moon agree with, and 0% agree with Brian Cox. And furthermore, a few years ago, 49 of NASA's top scientists, engineers, administrators, and astronauts wrote a letter to the NASA administrator asking them to cut this climate nonsense out because it was destroying NASA's reputation. They had worked very hard to build up NASA's reputation, and Hansen and Schmitt and these clowns were ruining it for them. So Professor Cox's appeal to authority was pretty severely misguided. To me, it was like saying, because the Catholic Church the Jesuits did a lot of good work in science back in the 16th century, that meant that their theory of geocentrism had to be correct too. It's basically the same argument. Okay, so the other half of what was wrong, everything that Brian Cox said was wrong, but the other half of that particular slide where he's like holding up the officially holy water anointed NASA graph was that graph looks nothing like older graphs from government agencies. The National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder published this graph over here in 1974, and it showed that there was no net warming from 1870 to 1970. It showed that there was a lot of warming prior to 1940, And then there reached the peak, and then temperatures cooled very dramatically, and all of the prior warming was lost by 1970. In 1975, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences published a nearly identical graph showing a lot of warming in 1940, and once again, it was all lost by 1970. But if we look at the current NASA graph, I just want to make it clear that all the graphs I'm showing you now are just land graphs. NASA did not attempt to make temperature reconstructions of land and ocean, going back more than to about 1950 until the year 2003. And that was because everyone knew there wasn't enough ocean data to actually do any reconstructions. And so as Phil Jones said, in one of the ClimateGate emails, he says, so we just made it up. So we didn't have ocean normals in between 20 and 40 degrees south, so we just made them up, basically. And so all of the land ocean temperature graphs now are made just largely, 2/3 of the planet is just completely fabricated data, and most of the rest of it is too, actually. But anyway, in the land graphs, note that the 1940 to 1970 cooling no longer exists. Gavin has succeeded in completely erasing that period of Earth's history, which I think is quite impressive to hold the job. It's sort of like Orwell's Ministry of Truth, rewriting the past. Okay, so this is an overlay I made with identical scales on both axes. The red line is NASA current graph. Actually, that's probably worse now. I made that a month ago. I'm sure they've cheated more than they did then. The black line is the National Academy of Sciences graph from 1975. You can see how they've completely erased that cooling. And in this, I've got another overlay here. Oh wait, so on the left, I have a quote from Tom Wigley, a ClimateGate quote from Tom Wigley to Phil Jones, saying, it would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip? So they made up their mind they were going to remove it, and then thought they'd try to figure out some way to explain it after they did. And that's exactly what they did. The 1981 graph is Hansen's graph, and it showed, once again, these are at identical scales on both axes. It showed the warmth of the 1940s and subsequent cooling. By now, between Hansen and Gavin, they've succeeded in completely erasing that. Good work if you can get it. Okay, so furthermore, so this is a quote from Tom Carl, who was head of NOAA's National Climatic Data Center until a few weeks ago when he finally retired. Right. So when I presented this, at CEI a couple weeks ago, when I said that Tom Carl had just retired, there was a huge cheer out of the entire group. But anyway, so in 1989, Tom Carl said that almost all of the warming that had occurred up to that point occurred before 1919, and that Earth had actually cooled from 1921 to 1979, followed by some more warming between 1979 and 1989. Okay, so on this graph's a little hard to see, but I plotted a red line for the current 1921 to 1979. NASA now has 0.6C warming during that same time period when Tom Carl said the Earth had cooled. It's amazing they've actually, Tom Carl is one of the world's top alarmists, and they've even reversed his global cooling. Okay, in 1961, the New York Times said there was a unanimous consensus of scientists from all over the world that the Earth is getting cooler. In 1970, another article from the New York Times, the U.S. and Russia were very concerned about why the Arctic was getting colder and the ice was ominously thickening. And they were worried that a new ice age was coming in. And then, once again, in late as 1971, NOAA said global cooling since World War II was indisputable, and that it cooled about half a degree centigrade during that time. But once again, go back to the NASA graph from this year. All of this indisputable, unanimous consensus, Arctic ice thickening, Arctic getting colder, we're all going to die, and ice age cooling is now gone. They've erased it. Very impressive work by Gavin. Okay, and Gavin, foolishly, I've been harassing Gavin for years, NASA for years, to try to get them to release their older temperature data, which they've hidden as well as they could. They write over it in place every month to make it harder to trace all of the nasty stuff they're up to. And so Gavin came up with this bizarre idea that if he actually put up a website where you could actually go and compare the different versions of it, it would vindicate him. So I looked at it and I said, well, this is great, because he sort of incriminated himself with it. So this is the 2000 version of Gavin's land temperature data. It had 0.5 C total warming from the start of the period to the end of the period. By 2012, Gavin and his buddy Jim Hansen had increased that from 0.5 C warming to 0.9 C warming. And now we're up to 1.4 C warming. So Gavin has nearly tripled global warming since the year 2000. So that says, okay, so maybe the Earth's warmed a lot in the last 15 years. So that's where this comes in. So this compares RSS satellite temperatures. This is the 5-year mean of RSS land troposphere temperatures, and in the lower line going down, and the upper line is NASA land temperatures going up. You see, there's a huge divergence started occurring at the year 2000. So basically, Gavin has tripled global warming during a period when satellites actually show that the Earth is either cooled or not warmed at all. So it looks pretty bad for Gavin, and I certainly expect that next year is going to be a very difficult year for him. After January 22nd. Hopefully he's fleeing the country. Okay, so the thing that I've studied the most is actually U.S. temperature data. U.S. temperature data is really impressive because we have an outstanding temperature data set in the U.S. We have about 1,200 stations in the United States Historical Climatology Network, very evenly spaced. A lot of them have very long contiguous records. It's really the only large data set in the world that I really try. I suppose Central England temperatures is pretty good too, but that's a very small area. But the U.S. is a large area, and we have a very good data set. And the blue line there shows what NOAA's actual published raw data looks like. As you can see, it was warmer in the 1930s, and we've had some cooling in the United States over the last 80 to 90 years. But the data that they released to the public, when they released graphs, they used the adjusted data, which is the red line, which shows the U.S. warming. They show a pretty strong warming trend. So they've actually reversed the trend over the last 80 to 90 years. In other places, they can make excuses, fill in data. But in the U.S., they have no excuse. And this sort of traces back to, in 1999, Hansen wrote a paper where he was lamenting the fact that the U.S. wasn't warming, as he said, during the period when there was a rapid increase in carbon dioxide. And he was wondering, what's wrong with the U.S. temperature data? Why doesn't it match our garbage temperature data, our garbage global temperatures, which we've already manipulated? So him and Tom Carl got together and came up with a solution, which is United States Historical Climatology Network version 2, which corrupted the U.S. temperature data even worse than they had in version 1. And actually, at this point, every month about 45% of the U.S. temperature data is now completely fabricated. About 45% of the stations don't report each month, and so they just make it up at this point, which is what a cool job doing that. All right, so I got a good story. So NOAA declared that September was the hottest or second hottest September on record. And one of the places they put as hottest on record was Namibia. So I went and checked NOAA's Namibia database. They don't actually have any thermometers in Namibia. They don't have one single thermometer, but they still declared it to be the hottest on record. They invented, and satellites showed that Namibia was just about average in September, but actual data is not necessary when you've got a climate treaty you need to push through the next month. Okay, so going back to Tom Carl, some self-incriminating evidence from Tom Carl. In 1989, he said that this is from the New York Times again, U.S. data since 1895 failed to show warming trend, and they said that neither temperature nor precipitation had shown any trend over the past century in the United States, which essentially means the climate is not changing. But obviously this isn't very good for raising funding because nobody wants to spend billions of dollars studying a non-changing climate. Oh, I got another good story about that. So the University of Colorado got a $1 million grant to study the effects of climate change on prairie dogs in Boulder, Colorado. Prairie dogs. There's little rats that live in holes. But if you actually look at the NOAA temperature data for Boulder, they show that the temperature in Boulder hasn't changed over the last 60 years. So that they're spending $1 million studying the effects of climate change on a place where the climate isn't changing. You gotta love it. And then I come down here and people accuse me of getting funded to be an evil climate denier and destroy the climate. They're getting $1 million to study prairie dogs. And I always felt like, well, probably the problem with this prairie dog town is that they built a building where the prairie dog town. You said that I think that's a more dramatic effect. Okay, so this one is just showing that it's not just temperature data that these people are causing mischief with. We've also got sea level data. So what I put as an overlay here of Hansen. Hansen wrote a paper in 1982, which is the black line below, and it shows that sea level essentially stopped rising after about 1955 for about 30 years. The sea level rise was only about 1 centimeter from 1955 to 1980, which once again wasn't going to do any good for raising funding. So they got together with CSIRO and decided to make up some fake sea level data, which now shows sea level accelerating after 1940 instead of decelerating. And basically what they did was, there was a paper by Church and White. They just basically cherry-picked a bunch of stations that were subsiding into the ocean and said, okay, sea level's going up. This is bad, we're all going to drown. All right, so this is another one of my favorite articles from the Maitland Mercury from sometime in the middle of the 19th century. The Aborigines talking about how the climate used to be really nice before the white men showed up in Australia and ruined it for them. So you guys are getting blamed for this for a really long time. This isn't something new. This is another one of my favorites. 1907 from the Monthly Weather Review of the U.S. government. It says, the misuse of meteorological data is a crime against the community. It's up to the independent press to repress all climate cheats and hoaxes. I don't think they said climate. But so I see that as being the role of bloggers, people like myself and Tim and a lot of you guys too. That's our job, is repressing the cheats and hoaxes in our governments. Okay, so the summary of the first part is, so Brian Cox held up this anointed graph with holy water, which had been massively altered. the small group of people at NASA who generated the graph had absolutely nothing to do with the Apollo program. Had they been part of the Apollo program, I'm sure that they never would have gotten a rocket off the ground because they're completely incompetent and dishonest. The NASA people actually did go to the moon, agreed with Senator Roberts and with the skeptics, not Brian Cox. So I would say that Brian Cox made a very clumsy appeal to authority, did no research to back it up. But he does have much better hair than I do. Okay, so the next part I just want to do a little bit on who are these wonderful experts who our governments are listening to and are setting our policy. So in 1997, Paul Ehrlich from Stanford University came down to Australia and blasted the Howard government for their terrible climate policy, how the climate was going to be destroyed because you Australians were not going to solve the imminent climate crisis, which is about to kill us all. And the same guy, Paul Ehrlich, in 1970, he also told us that the oceans would be dead by 1980 and that the United States would be out of food and water by 1980. So this guy's a real expert. But he gets worse. I think Tim's going to talk more about Ehrlich. He's quite a guy. So in 1969 in the New York Times, he proposed that we poison Africans in order to keep their population down, because he's worried about them. And then in 1990, Ehrlich went further. He not only wanted to kill off all the poor people, but he actually wanted to kill off the rich people too. So he just basically wanted to kill everybody in order to save the climate. Okay, so another one of our favorites, of course, is James Hansen from NASA, who in 1988 predicted that Lower Manhattan would be underwater now, actually. And I was in Manhattan recently. It did not appear to me that Lower Manhattan was underwater. I may have missed something. I did see Hillary collapsing into a van in Lower Manhattan recently, but I don't think that had anything to do with sea level rise.
It wasn't a prison van, was it?
Yeah. Well, that'll be their next one, hopefully. Oh, and Hansen said the West Side Highway will be underwater. There will be tape across the windows, and because of high winds, and the birds won't be there. That guy's a complete whack job. Okay, so this is a graph of the NOAA tide gauge in Lower Manhattan, showing what it's done over the last 20 years. And you can see there's been absolutely no change in sea level in Lower Manhattan over the last 20 years. So I think they're pretty safe for the time being, at least until the West Antarctic ice sheet collapses, which I understand is going to happen any day now. Any minute? Yeah. Every year. Yeah, actually, there was an article. The head of the National Science Foundation Glaciology Program, sometime in the 1970s, said, "We're seeing the West Antarctic ice sheet on its way out. It has nothing to do with the climate. It's just the dynamics of unstable ice." And another article from about 1930 was discussing how the Ross Ice Shelf had retreated 30 miles since it was first seen sometime in the 19th century, and they thought that process had probably been going on for centuries. Oh, and so when we were in Parliament the other night presenting this, I started talking about some journalists started attacking me about glaciers. They said, glaciers are melting. I said, well, they've been melting. So they've been melting for 20,000 years. And I gave him one specific example of a glacier in Alaska, which has retreated a lot over the last, since about the late 18th century. And he said, well, yeah, that was when we started burning coal. So somehow, like, these two extra molecules of CO2 in the atmosphere somehow managed to cause the Muir Glacier to retreat 30 miles before John Muir saw it in the middle of the 19th century. Okay, so here's some more experts. On February 20th, 1969, the New York Times predicted an ice-free Arctic by 1989 and catastrophic shifts in climate. And then 3 days later, they predicted a new ice age. the same New York Times, all the news that's fit to print. Okay, in 1989, the top UN climate experts said we only had until the year 2000 to save the world from global warming. For crop failures and an exodus of eco-refugees. So you guys are looking pretty good for having survived that 16 years ago. Okay, in 2004, the UK's government's chief scientist said global warming was going to get really bad and we were all going to have to move to Antarctica to survive. I checked the temperature there a couple weeks ago. It was like 100 below zero or something. Okay, in 2012, the UK's Environment Secretary said that the UK was now in a permanent drought. And about 3 weeks later, it started flooding, and it's been basically flooding ever since. I love The Guardian. They're just such a great source of entertainment. And then, of course, David Jones from the Bureau of Meteorology in 2009, he said that Southeast Australia was now in a permanent drought. And it looked to me when I was driving down from Canberra this afternoon, it looked pretty green. It's probably the greenest permanent drought I've ever seen. In fact, it looks sort of like Ireland driving down there. So here's my conclusion. So blindly accepting consensus or authority is not science. In questions of science, Galileo said, in questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual. And then this is the theme of my blog, Richard Feynman's quote, "Science is the belief in the ignorance of the experts." And I don't think there's any case where that's more true than with climate science. That's it.